Okay, in this video I want to go through the major skeletal landmarks that you really need to know if you want to have some success with understanding the anatomical construction of the body. This is something that you're going to see me and hear me talk about again and again, and I think every bit of figure work that I do begins with me identifying these points on the body. And what we're going to be looking at are the points on the skeleton that are close to the surface of the skin, and these are going to really help us to orient ourselves, deal with proportion, and then later on work out how the muscles are threaded around from and to each point. The good thing about these points that I'm going to show you is that they are very close to the surface on every body type. So these are going to be things that you will see kind of in some way on every person. They do present a bit differently, so some of the points on the skeleton I'm going to show you on a very lean person, they're going to appear as a sort of bump, but on a very heavy person there might be a lot of fat tissue and flesh around this point, and then it will appear as a kind of indentation or a dimple, but it's going to be there nonetheless. They're not always visible all of the time in every pose, because it's going to vary according to lighting condition, the pose itself, and other factors, but these are things that you can definitely use to your advantage, and they're probably the single most important thing to learn if you're interested in studying anatomy, and they're super useful. So I'm just going to go through and show you them on this model. So we've got we can see these in 3D. So the first one I'm going to show you is this point on the pelvis, and this is called the pubic symphysis, and that word I think comes from the Greek, which means, I guess, the same root as the word symphony. It means growing together. So you've got these two bones of the hip, and they're coming together at this point. And this is a great landmark because very often this is going to be your halfway point down the height of the figure, or very, very close to it. So you can see that's immediately something that's really useful. Looking at halfway between there and the floor, it would give us the bottom of the knee, around here. But there's actually quite a lot going on at the knee that we need to pay attention to. So we've got the kneecap, obviously. This is something that's right below the surface of the skin, and you can test all of these things out on yourself by just feeling them. So you can feel your kneecap. To the side, you're going to be able to feel these kind of hard surfaces of the head of the femur, and the same on the inside. And below that, underneath the kneecap itself, the patella, is quite a lot of fat and fluid, so it goes very soft here, and just underneath you'll see that the tibia has a kind of bump here. So this is kind of what you kneel on. Sometimes people refer to it as the kneeling point of the tibia. From there we've got this kind of double crest, really, that joins up and turns into that sharp knife edge of the shin. And you do see evidence of this very often. Now, the line I'm drawing here is also going to be the boundary of certain muscles, and here too. So we've got the crest of the tibia and this kind of plateau here, even though it's modified by fat these things are going to be in evidence. Back out to the side view, we've got the head of this bone, the fibula. That's also close to the surface, so you can see there's a lot to think about with the knee, and that's a good thing, because there's a lot to latch onto, it's a lot to use, so don't be put off by having a fair bit to remember. If you remember these and study these well, the whole rest of your job learning anatomy is 10 times easier. So let's go down to the foot. Well, before we do that, there's an important thing to say about the shin bone itself, the tibia. So you've got this kind of knife edge that goes all the way down. You can feel this on your own leg, and it kind of divides into two down the bottom and becomes much more of a boxy surface. But this entire inside surface of the shin is subcutaneous. That's to say just below the surface of the skin. When you go through all of these landmarks, it can sometimes be surprising just how much of the skeleton is visible on the surface. So the end of the bone of the tibia, these bumps are called, it's called a malleolus. So this is the medial malleolus, so the inside ankle, and this is the other one on the outside, the fibula. So it's your other ankle, and you can see that the inside ankle is just a bit higher, or the point of it is higher than the outside. Nearly the whole of the top surface of the foot is subcutaneous. This is going to be true for the hands as well. Oops. We've got these points on the skeleton of the foot. So there's going to be a muscle that comes from here to here and from there to there. The heel bone, the calcaneus, is also just below the surface. And the whole underside of the foot, its form is made up of flesh and fat pads. The fat in the foot is a very tough and kind of fibrous kind of fat. It's not the same sort of soft fat that we have in other parts of the body. It's a kind of structural fat, you might think of it as. Let's go back up to the level of the pubis, because we need to look at this, the head of this bone. So this is the femur, and the end of it here, this kind of big block, is another thing that is just below the surface, and a key navigation point for the muscles of the pelvic region. Up here we've got what is called the anterior superior iliac spine. The name can be a bit off-putting. I'm just going to make that clearer. But it's actually got a very clear logic to it. The hip bone is called the iliac bone. When they say spine, they kind of mean just a bump. Anterior just means at the front, so it's just the front bump of the hip bone. And they say anterior superior iliac spine because they mean it's the top one, because there is another one down here. There's the anterior inferior iliac spine. It's a less important landmark, but it's there. But I'm just going to take it out for sake of clarity in this session, because we want to stick with the major ones. Now if you put it on the other side, you can see we've got a triangle here, and this is how we locate the kind of basin of the pelvis, and also this is how we see how much the hips or the pelvis is tilted in the first place. Now coming from there, we can follow the ridge of this bone all the way round to the back. And it's kind of S-curve. And that too is an important landmark. It's the iliac crest. So the ilium being the hip bone and the crest of the ilium, the iliac crest. And where that takes us in the back is here to the posterior superior iliac spine. And if you go to the end of the coccyx around here, you've got another much smaller triangle than the one in the front, but this is a key thing to know about the posterior view of the body. So the bottom point of this triangle is going to be where the split of the buttocks begins, and it's not exactly the same as the level as the pubic symphysis in front, the halfway point of the figure, but it's pretty close very often, so you know again roughly where you are. Now none of these landmarks are to be there's going to be a great deal of variation, so you've always got to take this into account, but having some general rules is very useful. I'm just going to go up a bit and now look at the pit of the neck, and what we mean by that is this little notch here, and really it's made between, the end of the sternum here, between the two collarbones and the tendons of the sternomastoid muscle, which join in a kind of V shape. Again, you can just feel those on your own body, and you get a little depression or notch there, which is another important locator because it takes you to where the bone of the sternum begins, and this is entirely just below the surface. This is the breastbone, essentially. Now on some people, depending on their physique, you can see quite a lot of the cartilage or even the ribs, so that's something else you can look into, but we'll consider that a secondary order feature of the skeleton. Now right here there's actually a little depression in the sternum about there called the epigastric depression, but what I want to show you more importantly than that is just the arch of the rib cage, so coming down like this. This is very often in evidence as well, and it takes you down to the cartilage of what is the 10th rib. Now this is a female skeleton, so you notice that the opening of the rib cage is the angle is quite sharp. It's kind of 60 degrees, something like that. It's more common in the male skeleton to find that angle being something like closer to 90 degrees. There's a secondary aspect here that I think is worth pointing out. Just the point where the ribs attach to the cartilage. It's a good point to know because it's along that line is kind of where the front of the body, you can see that it starts to turn a corner kind of around there or thereabouts. Let's go up to the pit of the neck again, and then we can look at the collarbone at the top, and this is again something that is right close to the surface, and this kind of very clear S-curve, and you can see that the end of the collarbone here kind of mates with this little platform that is the extension of this bone here, the triangular bone of the scapula, the shoulder blade. Now this platform is called the acromion process in anatomical lingo being another word for kind of bump or protrusion. Now you can see that, and you can maybe try this on yourself, if you walk your fingers along your collarbone, you get to the end and you get something of a kind of step down like that. And this point is really important. Sometimes people just call them simply the shoulder point, but they're really kind of, it's a useful landmark because this is where you're going to see the muscle of the trapezius stop and the muscle of the deltoid of the shoulder start. If we go into the back, we can follow that acromion process around into this kind of ridge of the same bone, which is also close to the surface, as is the medial border of the scapula. Look at the bones of the neck. They've got these kind of, each vertebra has got a spine, so you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The 7th cervical vertebra is this one, is the one that's most prominent. You do kind of sometimes, again it depends on the physique, you do kind of see 2 or maybe even 3 around there, but C7 as it's known is the one you want to pay attention to. Again, it's a very useful orientation when it comes to the neck. You can see between the pit of the neck in the front and C7 in the back that they're aligned on this plane, and that's really an important structural aspect of the neck, because the neck is it projects forward kind of like a tube, and the way to remember this is if you imagine somebody wearing a necklace and it's going up and around towards the back, you can see the way the neck kind of connects to the torso at this kind of in this oblique kind of way, this kind of oblique join. Okay, now to the arms. You've got 2, well let's say 3 landmarks at the elbow. You've got what we would commonly refer to as the elbow itself, which is the head of this bone, which is called the olecranon. On the inside of your arm, you've got this projection, which is called the medial epicondyle. And on the outside, you've got this crest, like this, the lateral epicondyle. You see a parallel to the knee in that if you follow this down, it kind of gets a little bit like the shin bone, the tibia, in that we've got a crest. It's much more subtle, but it's there, of the ulna. And this is going to be an important separation line between the 2 groups of muscles. But it's another important thing to note that the length of this bone is discernible kind of all the way, down most of its length, and when we get to the end on the back of the hand, it's aligned with on the little finger side of the hand. So again, it's a good way of when you're trying to do some detective work, trying to find where you are, finding that end and finding that end, you can extrapolate the rest of it. Likewise, when you get to this bone, and this is the radius, this portion of it is very much in evidence on the surface, and that's aligned with the thumb side of the hand. You can see and feel, we can more feel these bones of the carpus, the carpal bones, but we've got a lot of traffic coming over this joint in the form of tendons that contribute their own quite significant form. But generally speaking, we have a scenario not that different to the foot, whereby the back of the hand is nearly all determined by subcutaneous bony form. Like the foot, the undersurface of the hand is a fleshy, fatty kind of set of forms. Finally, let's look at the head. We're just going to point out a few things here. This is a subject all to itself, so I won't go too in depth here, but just to note, we want to be conscious of the line of the brow. We want to look at the temple, where the forehead turns to become the side plane of the head. But from there we have this kind of surface, which is the temporal line, and there's a muscle called the temporalis that fits into there. If you look at the base of the nose, the nasal aperture is roughly on a level with the base of the cheekbone. Follow that to the side, you get to this bony projection, which is called the mastoid process, and you can feel that right behind your ear. You can see this also brings us around to the base of the skull. And we have a bump around here. This back portion of the skull is called the occipital bone, and there's a protuberance there called the occipital protuberance. And again, that's something that can be more or less pronounced depending on the individual. Bony projections and features have a lot to do with the amount of growth hormone in an individual. So the more kind of testosterone, the more kind of lumpy and bumpy the skeleton is. That's one example. So what we also see is this arch. So it's called the zygomatic arch. The cheekbone is called the zygomatic bone. Really, the whole of the forehead can be considered a bony zone, where you're seeing a lot of this form directly on the surface. The muscles that you see on here are important from the point of view of expression, but they are very thin, and they're not the main drivers of the form of the forehead. I'll just wait while this saves my work. Another one, finally, I think would be looking at, from the brow line, we've got the external arch, the upper arch of the eye socket, but then you've got this internal one as well, being key. This plane between the eye sockets is known as the glabella. And we can put in things like the chin, the line of the jaw, and so on. So that gives us a good basic outline of the major skeletal landmarks in the figure. And my advice would be to learn these as absolutely thoroughly as you can, because it's going to pay dividends in terms of making the whole job of finding the muscles and trying to communicate them and just understanding the flow of the figure is going to make that so much easier and allow you to work with a lot more authority. Once you've done that, in the future it can be a goal for yourself to learn to really know the bones as well, because it's not enough in the end to just know these points. You have to be able to have a sense of the form of the bones themselves and their own characteristics. So that's the kind of long-term goal. The short-term goal is really just to memorize these and get used to putting them on your drawings, get used to making marks on reference images, so you can kind of get some practice in getting these into your memory. Okay, so that's all.